reform. We do have Senator Fierravanti-Wells back with us. Good morning, Senator.
Oh, good morning, Kelly. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Apologies, sir. I'm not too sure whether we lost the line on you there.
Technical things first thing on a Monday morning.
Absolutely. So, look, we did play a little snippet. I don't know if you heard it, of Scott Morrison making the announcement where he said the suspension was in place. I think you're suggesting the suspension should go further, and I guess my question to you is, wouldn't that inflame tensions with Beijing, which is clearly furious with us at the moment, and that relationship? But why do you think it needs to go further?
Look, I think that the language that has clearly been used by the media to report this is certainly way beyond what it really is. What the government is doing is taking steps to suspend the treaty. It is not terminating the treaty, and I think that this is a very important distinction, because when we do talk about suspension of a treaty, we are talking about the temporary cessation of the operation of that treaty. The treaty still remains on foot. Now, my view is that given the circumstances that are happening in Hong Kong, and given the language that has been used, it is clear that things are not going to get any better. So my view is that the treaty should be terminated, and I think that it can be done in two ways, either by using the extradition treaty itself and invoking the relevant termination clause, or utilising the provisions of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, which is clearly, given the language that the government has used, the mechanism by which it is pursuing this. So those are really my concerns. Suspension is less infringement and therefore a less radical measure, but suspension is really only a temporary measure. It doesn't, as I said, affect the existence of the treaty, and it does imply that at some point when the notice period finishes, that the operation and the performance of this treaty are resumed once the reasons for that suspension no longer exist. But given here that it would seem that the fundamental change that we're concerned about, which is the imposition of this national security law, then I think that it is clear that the fundamental change is such that it is a permanent one, and therefore I think that we should be going further and terminating our agreement with Hong Kong. I mean, let's not forget.
Is there support within government for you, anywhere within government, to go as far as that?
Well, I'm just saying that this is the natural step now. It's very clear what the circumstances are. We've known for quite some time what's happening. This is a bad law. And as I've been advocating for some time, it's very, very clear that the actions of the Chinese communist regime in relation to Hong Kong demonstrates that once again Beijing is not willing to have regard to its international obligations. I mean, it was very, very clear what the agreement in relation to Hong Kong was, and this was to be a two-systems framework that was a clear provision of the Sino-UK declaration. Now, this national security law clearly is in breach of that, and therefore I think that certainly there are concerns. There are concerns about the application of this law, not only in Hong Kong, but also here, because of course when you look at the insidious practices of the communist regime's operations around the world, the operation of its United Front Work Department and its operatives and those people loyal to it here, you know that there are many people of Chinese heritage who are naturally concerned about what this can mean for them. There are real fears in the community here about the application of its law, not only in Hong Kong, but extraterritorially, and that's really the concerns that I and others who have spoken in this space have advocated. I mean, the fear exists for many Chinese Australians who value democratic freedoms and do speak out about the communist regime and what this law can mean for them, but more especially what this law can mean for them if they do travel overseas, or more importantly, what it could mean for their families overseas.
Just given, again, the seriousness or the extreme, concerns you have here then, do you think just back to Hong Kong, do you think the visa pathway should be opened up to stipulate access purely for humanitarian reasons, not the economic reasons that the government is sort of putting at the forefront now?
Look, I think we have a very generous humanitarian program. As a former minister in this space, I've seen its operation. Like, for example, in 2018, 2019, our annual humanitarian program sat at almost 19,000 places. So the majority of which of those are for offshore. So when you do look at the groups that are resettled and the groups that do attract the humanitarian program, we know that people who are from Hong Kong would have access, and indeed the Minister was very clear on that comment yesterday on the ABC. They can apply for a humanitarian visa just as anybody else who faces persecution is able to apply for humanitarian visas, and those options are available to them. What the Immigration Minister has clearly outlined is a pathway for those who are here or those who may wish to come here. And whilst there are no guarantees, I think that he's made it very, very clear there is a pathway there. Clearly, anybody who applies for visas, there are security concerns, and clearly we'd have to we should be conscious of that because, as we know, this is a regime.
While you talk about that, couldn't suspending the deal, though, as going further than that and actually terminating it, couldn't that, as you're suggesting now, run the risk of fugitives or criminals escaping justice?
Well, the reality is that there's always with any visa issue, and these are two separate issues. This is an extradition treaty as opposed to people coming in. So I think we need to keep these two issues separate. In relation to people who may apply for humanitarian visas or any sort of visa pathway, there will always be checks that will have to be undertaken. And of course, as the Minister made very, very clear yesterday, there are tests like the character test, the national security test and the like that will have to be met. So it's not an automatic pathway. It could be an easier pathway, but it's not an automatic pathway. And of course, we do have to consider that there may be people who may slip through the net, and it's always a case, but the reality is that we will have to undertake the necessary security checks to ensure that anybody who does come here or anybody who does remain here is a person who is of fit character and passes the national security test and is a person of good character.
I guess given, though, the reaction we've heard from China, the concerns they've raised that this is a serious violation, just the suspension of the extradition order, would your approach cause additional dangers for trade? Beef and barley have been targeted. Local dairy farmers are very worried. The IRB review board is sitting on a deal that would see dairy farmers sold to part of a Chinese company. Could a harder line stance, as you're advocating, create more trade targets in Australia?
Look, I think what's very, very clear is post the coronavirus, it cannot be business as usual with the communist regime in China. And I have been advocating for many months now that it's important for the government to act on those things which are within its direct control, and that's namely, plan for compensation for the millions of taxpayers' dollars, and I've talked about this in the Senate, but I've also advocated for a plan to decouple from China for us to reduce our dependency on the communist regime. I mean, let's not forget, Kelly, that at the moment, a third of our exports go to China. Now, some of these exports are vitally important for China's economic growth, particularly the iron ore and the coal and those things. They are vitally important to China's growth. So we haven't seen a diminution of that trade. But also some of the other things that do go over to China are vitally important for its feeding of its population of $1.3 billion. The issue here is, as far as
Apologies, I've just managed to cut Senator Fierravanti-Wells off there as I take the line, so my apologies. We will try and get her back on briefly, but she was making a fairly strong point, as she was throughout the interview, about economic decoupling and termination there. My apologies, there's been operator error on my end there and wrapping up that interview. We'll try and bring you a conclusion to that. 7:26, ABC Illawarra. Kel Fuller with you this morning. Alex is letting